Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we have one of our final videos recapping the 2023 season as we're going to discuss some of the lessons learned from this iteration of the Jaguars, especially for myself over the last 4 or 5 months. So I've got 6 points I really want to hit on. I'm sure there's a lot more I could probably discuss the more I think on it, because honestly, this was a learning year for myself. This was a year where I think my expectations for what happened, my thoughts on what the Jaguars did were very wrong, and they were pretty far off as far as evaluating them. This was a team, as I mentioned in the last video, I predicted to go to the Super Bowl this year. And I was torn on whether I thought they'd win that or not, but I felt like this was their season. I thought it would be them in Kansas City, and, well, one of them made it, and it definitely wasn't Jacksonville. So there's a lot to learn on my side, and I want to share some of this stuff with you and just give you my thoughts on it. So with that said, we're going to hop right into this with my first point here, and that is that in the NFL, running it back never works. I have yet in my time as a fan, and this would be over the last decade or two I've been alive, I've never seen a team run it back successfully. I've seen teams run it back to the Super Bowl and then lose. Kansas City would be an example of that. Seattle would be another one. But you don't see teams repeat, bringing back the squad. The Bucks were another example of that because after they beat KC, who tried to run it back, Tampa Bay got knocked out in the divisional round against the Rams. And that's just kind of the results that you get when you try to do the same thing because everyone's going to be ready for the same thing. Everyone knows what to prepare for. You give them an extra year of knowing what you're going to do. And when you're complacent, players aren't challenged as much. They get a sense of security. Players perform worse. And ultimately, your team ends up failing at the end of the day. And so for Jacksonville, we look at the changes that took place this last year. It's very limited, right? Calvin Ridley was a new player on this team. However, we knew that back in October of 2022. That was prepared for. Everyone was already planning for that for, pretty much nearly a whole year before he ever took the field for Jacksonville. Your only change on the offensive line was bringing in Anton Harrison to replace Jawan Taylor, which was a very good move. I will give him that. That is one of the best moves I've seen from this franchise in my time as a fan. And, kudos to them for that. But that's all they did. And when they brought in players to supposedly challenge for positions, these guys were not players who were going to take over ever. You look, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but was Brendan Strange ever going to challenge Evan Ingram? No. Was Tank Bigsby going to push Travis Etienne? No. All these players are guys that are pretty clearly going to be backups on this team, and they might not be around after the rookie contracts, unfortunately, and they were just simply drafted way too high. So ultimately, the same squad that went to the playoffs last year, that had an incredible season and looked like they were one of the best teams at the end of the year, that just need another year to put things together and to have some continuity in the franchise, that same exact group of players ended up failing this year. And they did the exact opposite of what they did the year before. They went from being a team that could find ways to win every single week against all odds to finding ways to lose every single week against all odds. And so that same group, that mojo that they had is gone. That group is dead. And at the end of the day, even if they got back to what they were before, you're not going to see those same faces all here. There's going to be new ones. There has to be. And they're going to be forced to make some changes. So if you ever hear the idea from a team that they want to do the same thing again the next year, they want to take the same group of players, it's not going to work. Maybe Kansas City proves us wrong in 2 or 3 weeks, but I don't think they will, and I think it would be a little crazy, but you never know with them. But for Jacksonville, it's not going to work. So that's the first thing I really want to know. And you could also really define it as complacency, because that's something that this team gets. I think that they have a pride issue. And not that pride has to be a terrible thing, but I think this team, the moment things go right, it wants to think it's arrived. It wants to think the past is gone. They don't have to really replace what has been built here that's been bad for decades upon decades. And they ultimately get complacent. And every single time that this team has done it, they've failed. You look at every critical season, every time the Jaguars are going back at it after getting really close, they're always bad the next year, or they always take a step down. 1999 to 2000, team took a big step down from where they were. They were 14-2 that first year. They didn't make it back to that. You look at 2017 to 2018. They started off strong, but you could tell things were wrong, and they went from nearly making the Super Bowl to going 5-11 or 6-10. And then 2022 to 2023, the Jaguars may have matched records, but everyone who watched the team, and pretty much all of us here, know that this team this season was worse than the 2022 version. And so I think that's something that has to change in this organization. Complacency has to die. And I hope that's something that is focused on by this team, because if it is not, and unfortunately I think it probably will not be something focused on nearly as much, they will fail because of it. We'll see what happens though. So let's get to our next lesson learned here. So the second one I've got is that physicality wins championships in the NFL. And this isn't something completely new, right? Like, some of these points are things we already kind of know, but they've been reinforced to a T this season. And to explain this one, I want to take you through Jacksonville's matchups with the final 4 teams left in the NFL right now. This is being recorded, by the way, night before championship games are being played. So keep that in mind, because we don't know who's going to advance yet. But you have the 49ers and Lions, and then you have the Ravens and the Chiefs. So let's go through the last matchups with each of these teams. Starting with the 49ers. Played them in Week 10 this season. This team got manhandled by them. They got blown out 34-3. San Francisco dominated both lines. They could do whatever they wanted. And that was really the first game this season where people could see there's a big problem with this Jacksonville team. There's a big problem with identity. There's a big problem with physicality. And so they got manhandled. They did not contend against what was a Super Bowl contender. Therefore, they don't really belong in the group, because it's not like that was a fluke. That's a game that I think defined them this season. You take the Lions matchup from 2022. Now, a little farther back, right? But still, that's a matchup that was with a very similar squad, almost the exact same players. And what happened? Jacksonville got beaten the living crap out of in that game. They got their quarterback hurt. Trevor Lawrence went down for a moment in that game, did come back, thankfully, but they were out of it. They did not perform well. And I think a lot of it really came down to the physicality in that game. This team couldn't run the ball. They couldn't pass it because they were getting sacked. There's just nothing they could do. They were a one-dimensional team that couldn't succeed in the one dimension their offense has. Very much like this season. Take the Ravens game this year. Trevor Lawrence still struggled in that game. The team was not physical enough. They seemed lost. They got blown out, quite frankly, by the Ravens. I know it was technically 2 possessions, but we didn't even score a third of what they did. This team wasn't close to winning that game. And ultimately, like, Baltimore is a very physical team, and they out-physicaled the Jaguars. And you take the final one, the Kansas City Chiefs. Played them 3 times over the course of 2022 to 2023. Every single one of those games, Jacksonville struggled to protect Trevor Lawrence. They struggled to run the ball. This was a team that was not winning in the trenches. They struggled against Chris Jones mightily, even this season. And keep in mind, of course, that was one of Anton's first games. I think that had a factor in it for sure. But they could not succeed against him. And Chris Jones didn't even show up to training camp all offseason. He wasn't there. I know because I was technically in the building that he was supposed to be in. He was never there. And so Jacksonville still struggled in that game. They couldn't run the ball. They couldn't do anything. And so you see a common thing between all these contenders is that they're very physical. They have good offensive and defensive lines. Not always perfect, but usually pretty good. And that's how they get there. And for Jacksonville, do they have that? I think they do on the edges. Talking about tackles, talking about pass rushers like Josh Allen, Trayvon Walker. But on the interior, what is there? On both sides of the ball, your top guys, I think you could maybe try to say something about, be Devon Hamilton if he's healthy. And then if Ezra Cleveland returns and he plays like he did in Minnesota, then sure. But he's still a smaller guy. He's not this big, strong dude. He's not really super physical. So I don't even know if I could throw him out on that list. They lack physicality. And that is something that needs to be added to this team. Thankfully, it was talked about. It was actually mentioned by Trent Baalke himself without being asked. So I think they will focus on that, which is good. But they are not going to win without being a physical team. And they're not going to win without having an identity. And those are things that the Jaguars lack, and we have to hope that they do something to actually get both of them in 2024. So kind of along the same point here, I want to talk about the offensive line, and that is that the offensive line needs to be able to excel in both factors of the game. It is not enough to have an offensive line that can protect your quarterback but can't run the ball. And they've struggled protecting the quarterback. We all know that. Saw plenty of it at the end of the season. And there's some excuses, but those excuses don't make up for it. And why I say this is like back in 2022, up until I think around we played Kansas City, Jacksonville had given up the least amount of sacks in the NFL among all 32 teams. And that was with almost the exact same offensive line. Difference was Jawan Taylor for Anton Harrison. So they were very good pass blockers back then. They struggled a lot more this season. But what they weren't able to do both years, and you can see this pretty clearly too, if you look at PFF data, you just see how they generally grade out, because it'd be pretty fluky for every player to be wrong on this team as far as how they're viewed. This was a group of players that every single one of them, their strength was in the pass game. And I am not saying that's not important. What I'm saying is that if you have the option to keep around a group of guys that can protect your quarterback, but they can't do anything else, they can't get a run game going, they will die doing that, or to just make changes, you have to make changes. And this was something we actually brought up in the last offseason. Now, it was not as extreme of an issue to me at that point as what it is now, which is why I'm putting this in the video. But we did talk about how this team needed to improve their run game. They needed to give ETN the opportunity to run it up the middle, because a lot of the time they've had to bounce him outside if they want to gain yards. You look at the Tank Bigsby pick. Honestly, if we had a good interior to this offensive line that was balanced, that can do both aspects of the game, I think Tank Bigsby would be looked at a little differently as a draft pick. Now, do I like the pick? Not really. I think he should have gone the 4th round. I don't think he should have been picked there. But he could actually have value to this team if the one thing he's supposed to do was possible. And you can argue if you think he could do it or not, even if we had a good interior offensive line. But the truth of the matter is that last year, in 2023, he did not get a fair shot to even succeed on this team. And that's because this team has not focused on having an offensive line that can do everything you need to do to succeed. In Jacksonville, they were a one-dimensional team that had a very limited one dimension, as in they would only throw the ball 10 yards down the field at most. Once in a while, they'd take a deep shot, but that's all they did. They couldn't run the ball. It was a waste of downs. They couldn't get a 3rd and 1, a 2nd and 1, 4th and 1, whatever it was. If it's 1 yard, they couldn't do it. They just consistently could not do it. And so I think this offseason for this team, the offensive line, when they're done making their changes, needs to be capable of both protecting Trevor Lawrence and running the ball up the middle and to the outside of the tackles or in the gaps. It needs to be able to do all those things, because if it cannot, this team will not find success. They were lucky to in 2022 without an adequate run game, and in 2023 that was exposed. So this is very much an emphasis for me, to the point where if I have the opportunity to consider a player who is a great pass blocker, but not a good asset in the run game, I'm not picking him. I don't want him on this team, because it's the same old, same old. It's not going to have success for this organization. So those are my thoughts on what needs to change on the offensive line. Now, we'll get into our last 3 points here. First one of those is that honeymoons come to an end eventually. And this is not to say that I hate Doug Peterson. I don't think he's the guy. I don't think he's bad. I don't think he's like a guy that needs to get out of the organization. I think he's someone you build around. I think he needs to be here. I mean, we have to remember that Peterson was exactly what this team needed. They needed a guy who could change the culture, someone who would rid the stench of Urban Meyer from this organization, someone players could trust. And that is very much what Doug Peterson is. He's a player's coach, and he can be hard when he needs to be hard. And those are all great things. But there are problems that come with every single coach in the league. And you have to, as an organization, do what's necessary to mitigate those issues. Even for the greats, there are examples of this. Bill Belichick, for example. I think it was power in New England. I think that's why he's gone, because if he was just a coach, if he wasn't a general manager, and they were acquiring talent in the draft, they were scouting well, they were bringing in great players for him, I think Belichick, at the bare minimum, would have had probably one of the best defenses in the NFL and an adequate offense. And that team might be making the postseason consistently still. But Belichick was not able to run the organization well as far as acquiring talent and doing scouting. And he got into too much power. New England did not check it, because he's the guy who won 6 Super Bowls with the team, and now he's not there anymore. Even for Andy Reid, as much as people love him, and I'm personally a big fan of him, he has the same issue that Doug Peterson can have here and there, where he calls stupid plays. He does stupid things on the field, he gets too cute, and sometimes that costs his team. However, not as big of an issue with Andy Reid. You can survive with that. And so it's not really a deathly problem for Kansas City. For Doug Peterson, there's a few things for me. One is that, which is that he cannot stop himself from calling stupid plays here and there. His team does jet sweeps 10 yards behind the line of scrimmage when they can't block. I mean, just absurd things. The other thing that I think's become pretty clear over the last half of the course of the season is that he very much has a hard time moving on from friends, people he likes in the organization. He has a hard time, I think, being honest with himself about their performance. And having thought about everything with like Press Taylor, I could understand why he doesn't necessarily want to fire him, because a lot of this offense is what Doug Peterson wants run. A lot of it's what he's telling him to do. There's some of it, of course, Press Taylor's choosing himself, and the team was very limited in what they could do this season. And unfortunately, they tried to run things they couldn't. And I don't really like the whole overall strategy too much, but I think they can find success, and I think they can work things out. But what the problem is that there was essentially no accountability for Press Taylor. There's none of this, hey man, you need to get your head out of your ass and stop running jet sweeps and screen passes and maybe throwing the ball down the field, moving it, scoring points, getting a 3rd and 1. Like, you need to figure out a way to fix these things. And that was never done. And when Doug Peterson talked about how he performed, he said he did well. I don't think that's fair to say. So there's a problem there. And then there's also the things that we hear, the rumblings, the rumors, where you talk about defensive coordinator. And Trent Baalke tried to tell us on Thursday, oh, I don't actually decide that. That's all Doug. I just sit in on the meetings and I give a little bit of input. Let's be real. It was Baalke's guy who was hired at DC, who, I'll be honest, he was a better pick. Much better pick. He was the best guy out there that was available. So congratulations to him. He'll do at least one thing right all offseason. But who did Doug Peterson want, according to what we hear from sources within the organization? Marquand Manuel. From, I believe, the New York Jets. He's a safeties coach. Close friend of his. Is he a proven DC? No, he's never done it before. That was a problem for this organization. That was a lot of what led to our guy getting fired at the end of the season. And so I have this problem with him where I'm like, I don't fully trust his staff decisions because I think he tries to get in a lot of friends and there's a little bit of is a nepotism involved. I mean, his own son is a tight end on the team, and I don't know if he'd make the roster if Doug Peterson wasn't here. And hopefully I got the word right. It might not be nepotism. I think it is, though. So that's the issue with Doug. And so you have to find a way around that, because if you can get around that, Doug Peterson is a good NFL head coach. He won a Super Bowl. There's a lot that he can do well. And so I think a lot of this comes down to who's making all the decisions. I think getting an EVP is a huge thing. But the team ultimately needs to find a way to work around this issue, to find a way to succeed, to strengthen the strengths for Doug Peterson and mitigate how much the weaknesses impact the organization, however that needs to be done. And so we're getting to this point now because it's not the happy fairy tale anymore. The team went 9-8 again. They didn't make the playoffs, and they do not look like the favorites in the division. They might not win the division for a while. We'll see. But this is where we are. And unfortunately, sometimes the happy times come to an end, the honeymoons. So we'll get to our next point here, and that's going to be about the draft. And really the rest of this is going to be related to that. Because I think that is, out of every function in organization, the most important thing that you have to consistently get right as far as roster building. It's more important than free agency. Teams do not win by going out and spending the most money. It can help them. It can do things to mitigate failures from the past, but you have to be able to supplement it. And so I look at the draft picks Jacksonville made from 2023. And the point here with this is that the picks have to have upside to match the value. Not only that, but they need to be able to surpass that value. So essentially, there needs to be a scenario where, like, for example, the guy in this picture, Brendan Strange, needs to be worth more than the 61st pick in the NFL draft. Because if there's no scenario where he's worth more than that, your ceiling is that you just got an average guy for that position. That's not good enough. That's a failure by the organization because they need to do better than that to separate themselves. Otherwise, you're an average football team. So we go through this last draft. We look at players, where they should be valued. What's the best case scenario? It's not good enough. I mean, you have some exceptions, right? Because you have Anton Harrison, for one, who I think has already exceeded the expectations. He's much better than 27th overall pick. And Antonio Johnson should be a starter for this team next year. You got him at 160th overall. Tremendous value on those two. But what is the best case scenario for Brendan Strange? I mean, he's probably not a starter in the NFL. He could be a versatile, fun tight end too. You put back at fullback, you have him doing all this stuff, and he's kind of a weapon in the offense, more so. But even with that, there's very much a limitation to how much he can do, and I don't see him as someone who can start on this team. I don't think that would be a good idea. And so, is that worth 61st overall? No, it's not. Tank Bigsby. The upside for him, I think, is for him to be a really good RB2, to be able to pound out short yardage consistently, and to be able to relieve ETN so ETN doesn't have to take the amount of snaps he took early on this season. Is that worth, where did they pick, like 88th this year, somewhere around there? I think at the best case scenario, it's worth a little bit less than that pick. And for him to be anything more, to be an RB1, ETN has to walk. And then you're committing to an even bigger loss if that's the scenario, and Bigsby was worth the pick. So you're limiting how good these selections can be. Because you're picking players that can never fit up to the bill, or if they do, someone else has failed. That's a major problem because you can't win in that scenario. So things have to change with how you're making the picks. There's very simple things you can do. Because you need to look at your actual needs sometimes, too. I mean, it's not the first factor with the draft. But there's things like why is Osiris Torrance skipped at 56? You need a left guard. He's the best player on the board. You liked him in the pre-draft process, but you're so set on one player that isn't even the best on your board that you go select him? It's just absurd things that happen in the scouting department here at the end of the day, and that's what really holds this team back. But I think this is something that needs to change. You go look at 2021. That was an example of a draft where the upside actually made sense. And what happened in 2022? Those players actually broke out. The team got better. They went from worst in the league to making the playoffs. Now, that was also because of free agency, but those players were a big part of it. Trevor Lawrence obviously was going to be the first pick. Can Travis Etienne outplay 25th overall? Yes, he can. He broke records in college. And my gosh, if we're saying Jahmyr Gibbs was worth 12th overall, how is Etienne not having the capability to surpass 25th? Look at Tyson Campbell. I mean, there are redrafts where he goes in the first round already. He's a player who, obviously, he was injured last year. That hurt him a bit. But he's been a lockdown corner for Jacksonville when he's healthy. He's played well. And we'll see if he recovers in year 4 and it's not going to affect him. Let's hope for that. But Tyson Campbell was a player with upside that surpassed the value of the draft pick. Walker Little may not be a starter on this team long term, but they at least took a shot on someone who could have gone in the first round without injuries. Whether or not it was a hit. You hope they're hits, right? You need a hit for you to keep your own job. And so I think like a player like Walker Little, even though he may not be a hit, I can respect why they picked him. And Andre Sisco in the 3rd round. That's a hit. That's a player who had upside above the selection. You took a shot and you got someone. And so that's where you can actually see the success in this, instead of going out and saying, let's draft special teamers. We're going to focus on special teams. Out of everything that was said in the 2023 offseason, that is probably the one thing I look back on the most that makes my skin crawl. Because you basically are saying, yeah, we're going to make sure that our picks cannot be worth what they are. That we're going to go pick players that should not be going in this range because we feel like we're good enough. And they sure as hell paid the price for that kind of thinking. So that has to change. And that's something I think was reinforced heavily this season. You don't just draft a player that you feel like, oh, he could be special teams value, because you may miss on a player who actually is something for your team that's worth more than where you're picking. I mean, this team could have had a shot at a Puka Nakua if they were actually trying to find a player like that instead of being complacent. And we've even seen stuff over the last few days where it very much seems like Trent Baalke has a burner account on Twitter based off the fact that the picks were predicted 2 months in advance perfectly. And he even apparently admitted on the account that it was him when someone called him out. I mean, he's making decisions months and months before the draft. He's not even thinking about it. So a lot has to change. There are major, major problems with how players are being evaluated in the NFL draft for this team and what the importance is being placed on. So definitely something that I think was hammered home this season, made very clear. It has to be at the forefront of our minds going forward. And when we talk about what is best for this NFL team. And the final thing for me is that above all, the one thing that is going to make your team a consistent contender will always be great scouting. That is the one thing. You don't succeed by spending a ton of money in the draft. The only way that works, free agency. The only way that works is if you are able to draft well after doing that. You use it to supplement your roster, and you eventually replace those players with younger ones that you can afford, and you're consistently filling your holes because you can use that to jumpstart, but it's not going to sustain you. Scouting does that. Finding the right players. And you see in Jacksonville how that jumpstart has now fallen dead because they weren't able to supplement the roster with good football players in the draft. They've had some hits. They've had far too many misses. And now this team, in 2022, they probably had, 2 needs, arguably? You could say more if you want, like knowing what happened in 2023. But at the time, heading out of 2022, we would have said, team needs a left guard, need a slot cornerback, right? Those are the big issues. Well, Jacksonville didn't address a single one, and they didn't feel like they needed to address much of anything else. They didn't try to find players who could be future starters on this team. Now, how many needs do we arguably have? Well, possibly 2 receivers, at least one. We need, potentially, is possible, 4 offensive linemen, although I think it'll be 2 or 3. You need a defensive tackle, defensive end. You might almost need a linebacker, as disgusting as that is to say. I wouldn't draft one, but what they've done there isn't even good. And they've invested a ton of resources in that position for God knows what reason. You might need two cornerbacks. If they run a lot of man coverage, the only guy I think on this roster right now that you can justify as being really good in man coverage is probably Tyson Campbell if you think he can go back to what he was in 2022. And you got to keep him. He's a rookie in his 4th year, and he's played well for you before. He's played very good. Darius Williams, though, as much as I like him, he's not a man corner. He's incredible in zone, and that's where he needs to play. And depending on what you do at safety, you may need one there too, although I think Antonio Johnson should be the starter. So are there a lot more needs now? Yes. Was there anything done to fix any of those needs? No. There was one pick by accident ends up filling a need, and that's Antonio Johnson at strong safety. The rest of it, there was no plan. There was nothing done to make sure that this team would be ready when the time comes to move on from a player. And now we're sitting here as fans trying to figure out, how do we fix this? How do we make the Jaguars a Super Bowl contender in one offseason? And unfortunately, the answer is I don't think you can without divine intervention or something incredible or every single thing going right. I think realistically, knowing the odds of free agents hitting, draft picks hitting, you would have to be perfect to make this team a Super Bowl contender in 2024. And you can thank your GM for that. because he's the one at the end of the day who's responsible for that. So, recap through this really quick for you guys. So, we got 6 lessons mainly learned from this season. Those are that you don't run it back. You always need to be bringing in talent. You can't get complacent, and players need to constantly be challenged. This is something that Trent Baalke apparently said at his press conference. I heard him say it. Sure as hell doesn't mean it, though. That has to change in the organization. Physicality wins championships. If you are not a physical team, if you cannot win the trenches, say goodbye to any chances of the Lombardi Trophy, because you're not going to win it. And this is a team that fits the bill in that. They are not physical, and that has to change. The offensive line, you can't settle for being good in one aspect of the game. You have to be good in both. You need players who can succeed in the pass protection and run blocking. And this is a team that really did one, and even that sole one strength they had was very questionable at the end of the year when your quarterback went through 4 injuries over the season, 3 of them coming late in the year. Fourth one, honeymoons don't last forever. Everyone has a flaw. You have to find a way to mitigate that. And with Doug Peterson, I think we're learning some of those. I think we're seeing them unfold. Doesn't mean he's not the guy. Doesn't mean he can't win this team a Super Bowl, but Jacksonville needs to find a way to overcome those issues. They need to be able to bring in guys to this staff who are going to do great jobs rather than be someone's best friend. And not that he can never hit, not that none of his friends can be good at anything, but there has to be accountability at the end of the day. And then 5th and 6th, draft picks have to have upside. You can't draft players who at best are worth the selection. And then 6th, sustained success is impossible without high-level scouting. If you can't scout, if you can't get talent in the draft, if you consistently fail at it, your organization may be good for 1 year, but they aren't going to be good 2 in a row. They aren't going to be good long-term. You aren't going to be like the San Francisco 49ers who, in spite of trading 3 first-rounders for a guy who wasn't their man, Trey Lance, still are considered a successful franchise because with everything else they have done so well, even without finding that elite quarterback. So I think that says a lot about just how important being consistently good in the draft is to an organization, because you don't got to be perfect. You just got to be really good at it. So that's what I learned this year. And like I said, I'm sure there's other things I could have noted. Those are the main points for me. You guys share with me what you learned from the Jaguars. This was a season that really went a heck of a lot different than we thought. And there were some problems we could have seen popping up that were noted and very much happened. But we thought this was a playoff team. They were not. And now it's time to recognize why. It's time for people in the organization to be able to self-scout themselves, to be accountable, to make changes, to not do the same thing. Because if they do the same thing, they won't be doing the same thing next year because they'll be sitting on the couch at home without a job. Although, for them, they'll have a lot of money, so good for them. You know, they'll rob the organization. So that's all I've got, guys. I appreciate you watching. Appreciate you enjoying this channel. Want to shout you all out because last 4 videos or so, we're getting tons of engagement on here and really shooting up with subscribers and everything. So I'm very thankful for that. Really excited for next week. We're going to talk Senior Bowl. Hoping to have recap videos up, maybe do some YouTube shorts for the first time, recapping each day. We'll see what happens, but really excited to go out there and hopefully have some new names to talk about and some more insight on all these prospects for the NFL draft. So thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.